As you know, every year I get to introduce and interview somebody very interesting at Dreamforce. Last year it was Bill Clinton, who was an hour late, and we substituted in Stevie Wonder. Do you remember that? Yeah, wasn't that great? It was really, really exciting. And today I can tell you that our guest is on time. It's fantastic. And always a good thing. And I can tell you that he is really one of the great leaders in the industry who I've known for several decades. And his values and our values in this room are tightly aligned. You just saw the video about the 1-1-1 model that we've been talking about here at the conference and for so many years as part of Salesforce.com. 1% of our equity, 1% of our profit, and 1% of our time, integrated philanthropy, that as we become more and more successful, we're able to do more in the world and do more service. And as we talked about that, there was one company that came to us and said, we want to do exactly that. Then when we go public, we also want to do the 1-1-1 model. And that company was Google. And we were so excited about that. And we've seen that very unique set of values that we've talked about between Salesforce and Google in regards to the 1-1-1 model, in regards to the focus on cloud computing. We share a common architecture and belief in multi-tenancy and in shared systems and in scale and providing a level of equanimity to our users. And we also have a very unique focus where we're very big believers not just in the cloud, but in mobile and in social. I don't know any company that is more well positioned for the future of cloud, social, and mobile than Google. And that's why we are so fortunate to have a great leader here who's a technology leader, a philanthropic leader, a government leader, an industry leader, and someone who we've looked to now for years to see a vision for our industry. Please welcome Eric Schmidt.
Mark. Wow, look at this. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, welcome, Eric, to Dreamforce once again. We're so thrilled to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. I feel like we've done this every few years. We finally got it working.
We got it working, and it's amazing. It's a little bigger this year. A few more people in the room.
I was talking about cloud computing.
Cloud computing.
We talked about it 20 years ago.
Talked about it 20 years ago.
So do you remember the announcement we made in 1997?
Why don't you tell everybody here about that?
It's the one that didn't sell any. It's called the network computer.
The network computer, I remember that very well.
We were right 15 years ago. We just had to wait for the technology to catch up.
I think it's called the Android phone today, actually.
Okay, thank you for that plug.
I know a good setup when I see one, Eric. Eric, I want to talk about...
Seriously,
yes,
I think what is extraordinary is how you have managed with Salesforce to become the company that defines modern future enterprise computing. Had I told them what you were like when we first started hanging out 20 years ago, they'd be surprised. The fact of the matter is that Salesforce now articulates the best vision, I think, for how enterprises will organize themselves. Because you got it right. You rode the technology right, and you rode the wave at exactly the right time. So my congratulations to you and your entire team.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Look, I want to... Yeah. Thank you very much.
It's obvious.
Thank you. I wish I could take credit for it, but honestly I can't, because I really give the credit back, and they already know this, but everyone in this room is the reason that Salesforce is successful, because it's these customers who are the forward thinkers, the ones that are the early adopters, and it's just, I guess, if we do have a gift, it's that we have the ability to listen to them, because they do have the ideas and they've got the visions, and we're fortunate to have a relationship with all of them.
No, I agree. But the other thing that changed was that customers can now be a lot more empowered. With the architecture that you built on, that you empower, people can now, they don't have to build these very complicated systems that are sort of turnkey. Now you can take a combination of languages, libraries, and so forth, and build these new platforms. And that's the biggest change. It used to be that to do anything in the enterprise, you had to spend $5 million and wait 2 years, and it was always 5 years late, or something like that. And we were all part of that problem 10 years ago. You don't have to do that anymore.
You know, I want to talk to you about the future, but before we do that, I want to go into the past with you. And I guess one of the opportunities that we have together, you know, we've known each other so many years, I'd like to go back to when you were one of the first 100 employees in Sun Microsystems. You were an amazing visionary then. And I think that was 1982, 1983. Right. And you know, you had a huge vision. You were the chief technology officer at Sun Microsystems. You were working with some amazing computer scientists, with Scott McNeely, with Vinod Khosla, with Bill Joy, and so many, James Gosling, so many great computer scientists. And you had this vision for the future of our industry at Sun. Tell us about that. What were those times like? I mean, that really set the stage for today. You know, what were you thinking about then?
Well, it's interesting that Sun rode the early Unix adoption wave. And Sun was the best implementation of Unix at the time. And a lot of computer scientists in the mid to late 80s moved onto that platform. So we had, and remember, these computers cost $30,000 and $35,000, which after inflation would be a lot even more today. Today you can get the same performance for, you know, a few $1,000s. But nevertheless, we had engineering solutions as well as business solutions. And what we did is we sort of tried to imagine a world that was networked. And at the time in the 80s, everybody was operating on 2- and 3-tier computing, which was a recipe for being locked in. You were locked into specific applications protocols, specific security protocols. The systems were relatively inflexible. And by using network computing, which today is thought of as cloud computing, you could break through that. Now, what we didn't have is we didn't have all of the technology that's been invented in the last 10 years. So it's interesting, if you look at our messaging way back then, we were talking about the same problems. People had the same problems in their enterprises. They wanted to cross-integrate across their customers. They wanted to automate things. They wanted flexible systems. The technology had not grown up. So what I think has happened is that we went through a phase which was basic connectivity. Think of that as a first phase, which is remarkable now. You have internet pretty much everywhere. Then you had a sort of connection and publishing phase, which was the early phase of the web. Now you have this applications phase, which is morphing into the personal social phase.
Yeah, you know, that's you at the time you saw those amazing workstations at Sun, the server environment. What do you think the most insightful thing was, or what value do you think that Sun delivered to the industry besides the phrase "the network is the computer," that really opened that door for that next level for all of us today?
Well, the old Sun people, and I'm sure there are quite a few here in the room. I don't mean to call you old, but we are old.
How many people here used to work for Sun Microsystems? Raise your hand. How's that? Yeah, so, we have quite a few around.
We essentially invented the open systems model. Up until that, software was expensive, very hard to use, and so forth. And primarily, I think, due to the founders, not to me, the notion of the network as a computer and open systems is that the legacy of Sun essentially can be seen in the way the web works. So if you look, the open web platforms all use the same principles that Sun invented. What's interesting is when you invent something like this, we had to build everything ourselves. And in most cases, we had a one-off before the industry had volume. But at Sun, we typically were unable to translate from the one-off to huge volume. And that set up the fight between Sun and Microsoft, which ultimately, you know, changed the industry. And I should say that along the way, the Java revolution was another part of this. It became clear that the applications languages that were being used were incredibly inflexible and difficult to program in. Mm-hmm. And so James and Bill Joy and a few others invented what we now know of as Java. The vast majority of powerful applications in enterprises are Java-based today.
Well, you mentioned then the kind of the pending competition between Sun and Microsoft and the kind of these different paradigms. You know, how do you reflect back on that now when you saw kind of the emergence of you know, Microsoft's NT server, you know, which and the Windows architecture?
I think
where do you think that came together with Sun?
Well, what happens when you're in a successful company is you have a certain kind of arrogance. So it never occurred to me, for example, it's my fault, that somebody else could build a system that was as powerful as the ones we had that were Solaris-based, which you in fact used in an earlier career, that they could build one cheaper that had similar functionality. And I think one of the most important lessons for business is that there is a clever competitor who can come in and undercut your pricing point with new technology. You need to move forward in both volume and technology points and standardization. At Google, I think we understand that very well because we largely start with the price of free, which makes it difficult to undercut a pricing too much. But I think that this is a fundamental.
Would you have cut the hardware business off sooner, focused more on software?
Well, at Sun, question was debated a great deal, and the hardest issue was an internal meeting, and I'll still remember this, where we had a big fight because we were looking at the price points of what were Pentium servers, and that we could not get our hardware business cost margins down to compete with the Pentium servers. And that was the point when I should have said, oh my God, we have to have a different strategy. We have to become more vertical or more specialized or so forth. But if you're in a horizontal volume business and a new entrant comes in with a similar price and you can't get your margins down and your volumes up for whatever reason, your distribution channel, your marketing costs, your manufacturing, poor management, me, whatever, fix it.
So do you think that was the seminal moment then? Yeah. Do you remember a specific meeting or a specific time?
I do, and we had quite an argument about this. This was in 1993, 1994.
This is Scott and the whole team.
The usual suspects. And what happened was the issues that Sun had, and I say this with respect to Sun because it was a great company, were masked by the bubble. And bubbles make everything good, right? Bring back the bubble, right? Everyone is more handsome, lives longer, is whatever in bubbles. And the bubble sort of created a lot of artificial demand, which then extended that particular technology platform for another 5 to 10 years. It also then set up the transformation to where we are today.
Now, you moved from Sun into another battle with Microsoft when you went to Novell as the CEO. And of course, Novell had really pioneered the whole concept of NetWare, the network loadable modules, I remember extremely well. A lot of operating system and server breakthroughs, SPX, IPX, and if I get that, I haven't used that term in a while. I don't know where that came from. It just flew in. And what do you think NetWare and Novell's challenges were against Microsoft in the server world?
Well, originally in networking, there was not agreement on standardized TCP/IP, which we all have agreed to today, and there were a proprietary version called IPS-XPS that in fact was the dominant one, which had been invented by a team out of University of Utah in Provo, which ultimately became Novell. And I assumed that you could build networking devices that would serve as high-speed servers if you just moved over to TCP/IP. Again, my error was in not understanding that the other guys would have significant economies of scale. We also had a few Microsoft bad business tactics and other things to deal with. But again, the technology consolidated around a new platform and you had to move quickly. So again, the lesson to be learned over and over again as tech is it moves, and if you don't move to it very quickly, it's very hard to get back on the race.
Now, you had a great opportunity when you left Novell. You became the CEO, obviously, of Google, and it was a young company at the time. It was really just a few employees, and Larry and Sergey. What did you see at that time? What was the most exciting part of Google for you when you became the CEO?
Well, I went to Google not understanding very much about Google, but liking the people. And I think I'm old enough now to say to all of you that life is short and you should spend the time working with people you enjoy. And I found at Google, frankly, people, right? You could. And I've spent some time with the Salesforce teams, and they have your sort of fun. It's a fun place to work. And maybe that probably translates into business productivity as well. But it's just good life productivity. So in my case, that was in fact the filter that I applied. I had done enough of the other kinds of models. And what I liked about Google was there was a sense of everything was possible, that every new idea was possible, that there was in fact an architectural change that had been brought around by the development of these new algorithms. And Google also has, and is still today, run in a largely decentralized way. And in our world, it's roughly true that the superstars are these creative computer scientists who can invent these new platforms. And somehow they're able to get these teams together and do this very quickly and sort of change the world. There are other companies that operate that have these sorts of people. Apple is an obvious example and so forth. And Google is particularly well decentralized, so it meant a surprise every few hours, mostly positive surprises.
So when you look back at that and you went into Google and you saw that high level of decentralization, but high level of innovation, how did that compare to what you were doing at Sun? Because you were also creating a lot of innovation, a lot of transformation.
Again, I had been trained in the classic microcomputer model where you have 2 to 3 year time frames, you have development cycles and so forth, and everybody's very predictable. The web's not like that. And you're much better off if you organize your system around a continuous iteration model. And we now have language for this, but a decade ago we couldn't even talk about it. And the idea basically is these new systems are so flexible, you just make them better every day. And that goes against all of the classic engineering management, engineering planning. It's the way CIOs have been trained for a decade. I think, especially here with folks here who are using Salesforce and all of the other sort of services, just run faster. Just figure out a way to release a new version of your software every day, right? Without breaking anything. Mm-hmm. It's hard, but it can be done. Furthermore, there are new collaborative software development tools that allow you to dynamically develop and test in an iterative model, so you can really do this. Once you've mastered that, do it globally. And when you've done all of that, you've got a world-class software development organization. And the tools are good enough now that you can operate that way.
Yeah, it's really an amazing shift we've seen in software development, including the agile development methodologies and Scrum teams, and the way not just the technology organization, but the human organization. But there's something else amazing happened at Google, because when you see the competition at Sun with Microsoft and Novell at Microsoft, this time at Google you really clean Microsoft's clock. So what do you think Google did so well to really keep Microsoft at bay, first at search and now in so many other areas, including mobile?
It's hard for incumbents to move to the new model. And in Microsoft's case, they couldn't quite move as quickly.
Clayton Christensen is actually here, so.
Yeah, so and of course he's the pioneer in this idea. And there are many reasons why people don't make that transition. One is just knowledge, another is resources, and another one has to do with this commitment to keeping customers happy. You have to, on the one hand, you want to keep all your customers happy. You never want to lose a customer. On the other hand, you've got to make it to this new model. So you're always sort of stuck in this. Now, if you follow the model I'm describing, where you're continuously iterating, that model works. But if you have these classic and relatively hard designed platforms that Microsoft has had, very difficult for them to make that model. In our case, we had the benefit also, I think, that because we understood the value of these computer scientists and we understood the value of the data centers, we had the best data centers at the time. We had the most interesting places to work. And so we were able to get sort of the best talent. And I think that helped define the era for us. Search is a very, very hard problem. You think it's relatively straightforward. We'll take all this information, we'll sort of rank it, we'll do some little computation. Do it with 1 billion items, and then do it with 100 billion items, and do it when 1% of those are changing every few minutes. Computationally, that's one of the hardest problems in computing. I think and we were able to sort of break through that. What's interesting about the enterprise is there's always a presumption that the enterprise stuff is different somehow. I would argue that the scale of what enterprises are doing now is so interesting from a computational perspective that the best computer scientists should be working on these problems too. I'll give you an example. Google Apps, which we have partnered on for, 5 years since we did that deal? It's gone very, very well. Has 40 million users. We add something like 5,000 firms a day to the system, and the level of cross-connectivity is very, very high. Now add the social component, which you're leading in, and imagine that every one of those users is click, click, connect, talk, post, off they go. You have a very hard technical problem. And so again, enterprise computing ends up having all of these scale problems that we see in the consumer as well.
You know a lot about enterprise software. You've been on the board of enterprise software companies. Yeah. How do you see that shift happening as we're moving forward? Do you see momentum?
Yes. What's interesting is that many people doubted that the cloud computing apps model would work. If you go back to the year before you guys went public and you read the reports, the conventional wisdom was that these were toy systems, that they were not going to be reliable, that people would not store their information in the cloud. And that was all wrong. So what you learn is you read all the conventional wisdom and think about it. Now think about what's really going on here. Wouldn't it be better to have a professional who's operating at absolute scale with a very strong incentive to keep you happy, right, from a security perspective, and trust them to move, again, they have to be good, which again, you guys are. It actually works. So I think the most important message is that entire generation of sort of PC application software where you charged a whole bundle per desktop. And remember, these were PCs, as you were locked into the architecture, was called client-server computing or three-tier computing, charged by the desktop and so forth, has largely been wiped out by this new model, of which I think you guys are really the leader in. And that bodes very, very well because that says that as your infrastructure gets established, a whole new generation of companies who will eventually compete with you all, by the way, so it's always the issue, they're going to come in and sort of on top of this data architecture that you're building, and they'll build new systems that are only imaginable today. I was thinking about it. If you have the Salesforce architecture, at least as I understand the way you guys have built it, you have a unified database around customers. You have a single point where you understand what all your customers are doing, and then you federate out to all the different application services. So you have the solution for the philanthropy, and the solution for the support groups, and the solution for the sales groups, all against one common database. I think that's a layman's summary of your architecture. Out of that, now put on top of it knowledge engineering, where we can go and look at what people are doing, and with modern computer science, we can tell you things like we can predict when you're going to have a traffic jam. We can predict when you're going to have a next problem. That's the next generation of apps that are going to be built on top of this. It would not have been possible in the old architecture because the data was too scattered. It was all in all those rotating disks on those PCs. You couldn't analyze it.
We saw that also with Larry Brilliant, right, when he started to see that with Google search, and he saw when a certain number of people started searching on certain flu symptoms in any one particular geography, he could predict there was about to be a flu outbreak.
No, I mean, I'll give you the consumer example is easy. Everybody's using Android phones. The Android phone, again, this has to be with your permission. We have a product that will do this. You basically allow it to report your position. So we can aggregate that information anonymously, and then we can tell you real time what's happening in traffic, okay? Now, are there business analogs of that? Well, of course there are. As a business person, you want to be able to predict your inventory, your sales cycles, you want to predict all of the things that are going on. In marketing, you want to understand when people are coming to your website. All of this can be computed now and predicted. And computers are particularly good at now noticing exceptions. So they'll watch and they'll say, at noon on Wednesday, there was a peak that's never occurred before. Maybe you should figure out. These alert models are also, I think, coming into play, and that'll transform the way businesses work. I mean, you think it's real time now, it's really going to be real time when we can go over all that data and calculate that information.
Yeah, now you're jumping quickly into the future, which is very exciting, but before you do that, I just want to stay with Google, and I want to ask you about the shift. Google made an incredible shift from Google Search, obviously Google Apps, Google Labs, lots of interesting applications, but also Android. Android has been a huge success, a huge market share gainer. You had the opportunity of also witnessing that at Apple. You were on the board there for many years as well.
Yes, I was on the board until I couldn't stay on the board anymore. The Android story is in many ways, it's interesting you asked.
You've been on the board of a lot of amazing companies. You were on the board of Siebel, which was an old enterprise software company I heard about.
Yes. Let's not bring that up. But you did very well. Let's talk about Android. When we were working on Unix in the 1980s, I wasn't clever enough to think of a strategy that would maintain fragmentation, that is, avoid fragmentation, but allow for open platforms. The team that has done Android has a pretty good model for that. What they do is although Android is open source and you can do anything you want to it, if you want to sort of use the brand and so forth, you have to be able to run the application store. That's the requirement. And that's such a powerful incentive that it keeps all the people who would otherwise go one way and the other and fragment Android together. So rather than using a contract, which is the old, if I could say, Microsoft model, or a no contract and hope for the best, which was an Eric optimist model, now we have a pretty strong carrot and stick model where the people who really want the benefit of the platform have a high incentive to maintain API compatibility. So on the one hand, the licensees feel like they have a choice, and they really can, but they also have a high incentive to stay within this boundary of compatibility. And I think that's, in many ways, the legacy of Sun. That these ideas were pioneered by Sun, but not fully implemented at Sun. We weren't smart enough to see this kind of an approach, or maybe it wasn't available to us. And I think that if you look at Android today...
Well, not all of the pieces were there, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the great things that we've seen was HTML and the web browser. Sun didn't have that. We were still in the motif world and all these kind of proprietary interfaces. That made Sun so, it made it too much its own box. Wouldn't you say that was a
And HTML5 is sort of the next leveler of the frame. Give you the numbers in Android. Android has about 550,000 phones are activated a day. So that's 500,000 phones per day. You can do the math. That number has grown in 4 months, doubled in 4 to 5 months. So if that continues, it'll fill the planet, right, at that compound growth rate. So obviously it'll slow at some point. So there's a hunger for a multi-platform, multi-vendor, highly competitive hardware platform, which is what Android essentially enables, with there are more than 400 vendors of one kind or another, more than phone models today in the market, and many, many coming. We have a new operating system internally known as Ice Cream Sandwich for some reason, which is being released in October, November, which everybody's very excited about, with even more of these. And I was thinking with this group that part of the reason that you'll want to continue this transition to cloud computing is that your internal customers are all using mobile devices, and they want all that power on their mobile device, and they can't get it with the old system. They have to use the new cloud computing system, which incentivizes everybody to move to an HTML5 platform for that reason.
Did you ever think in your lifetime you would see Apple dominating the industry again and just crushing Microsoft by market cap and market share and the birth of these new platforms like the iPad?
No, and I think it's worth saying that what Steve has done at Apple is it's certainly the best performance of a CEO in the world in 50 years and maybe in 100 years. Because not only did he do this once, he did this twice. It's truly extraordinary. And I think we've all benefited by that extraordinary innovation at Apple, and I say that as a very proud board member, former board member. And I think that what's interesting about Apple is that it's the rare company that can move to the new platform and get it right. And the lesson to all of us is that there's going to be an opportunity for each of us to do that in our business at some point. Now, I would certainly not be able to do it as well as he did and as they did, but it's possible to sort of model that and say, okay, what's that new brilliant thing that if I could just do my own startup and I didn't have all this history and so forth, what would it be? Then figure out a way to take the current company and get it there. It's important as a leader of your company to love the company you're in. So you don't want to spend your time saying, oh, I hate my company. Well, that's terrible leadership. What you want to do is figure out a way to lead it into this new platform.
Well, why do you think Steve Ballmer has struggled so much? Obviously, they had they tried to make Windows Mobile. They tried to have this Windows everywhere philosophy and move all the Windows apps onto the phones and the tablets, and they all imploded. Where did Steve really? Where do the two Steves differ in their philosophy? They've both been in the industry approximately the same amount of time.
Well, there's differences in ability, but but let's not talk about the people. Let's talk about.
Let's not.
Let's talk about the.
But if you would go back and talk about the people, what would you say?
No, I'm going to. No, I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the corporations.
The corporations, I mean.
Yes, we're going to talk about the
Of
corporations.
course.
Microsoft was built around a model of control and licensing, and did a brilliant job of making sure that the hardware guys did not innovate around them. And they did that with a hammer and a.
They had to do that, right?
Well,
the control gave them some
they-
level of
well,
standardization.
This was their view at the time. And they did not organize around the consumer, they organized around the industry structure. And I think Apple proves that if you organize around the consumer, the rest of it will follow. And that's something that I did not understand until Google, because Google sort of runs in a similar way. Try to figure out how to solve the consumer problem,
Yeah.
and then the revenue will show up.
How do you think that impacts the culture? How do you think that those two philosophies between Apple and Microsoft impacted their culture?
Well, the simplest example is take a look at the complexity of a Microsoft product versus the simplicity of these other platforms, whether it's the Apple platforms where the complexity is hard to find or hidden. And remember, by the way, Apple is built on top of an equivalent of Unix. So all that
Right.
complexity is there, but it's hidden.
The old Next platform, right?
Literally, I can go in and use it in the old way. Whereas the Microsoft platforms expose that complexity. Now, as a computer scientist, I love that complexity, and it never occurred to me that people wouldn't love this complexity. So the average person, I'm the kind of guy who would repair his car at the age of 16. The average person doesn't want to do that. And I think what we learned another way of saying this is that the industry grew up in a series of stages where you had engineers who were trying to solve technical problems and they had relatively little of a sense of what consumers really wanted, to now generations, and let's talk about Facebook as an example, where they have a brilliant understanding of what that specific customer wants. And the technology just sort of enables that vision. And you see that with each of these new entrants coming in. And I think that's the if you will, over 2 decades, that's been the big shift. And that means that your customers changed. What I would argue about enterprises, and this is an important, I love the enterprise business. This is a business I've been in for 30 years. And so it's great to see how well we're all doing, that you're doing. Our business is, of course, flourishing in the enterprise. Is that if we just got a few more of the products in place in the enterprise, you'd see the same consumer revolution inside the enterprise that you do outside. That the integration of the tools and the sort of the ease of use, which has eluded enterprise platforms, is now possible because of cloud computing. And it's not because they're not any more complex. They are very complicated, but we can now layer that using modern API libraries, HTML, so forth and so on.
So, when you look back at the last 30 years, you've met all these amazing leaders. When you see Mark Zuckerberg, who's kind of leading a social revolution we've been talking about here, who does he most remind you of all the people that you've met along the way?
Well, I think what Mark has done is really impressive. I think it's, especially when he faced really difficult choices. People forget that 6 years ago they were under great attack. MySpace was winning. They had an offer to be purchased from, I think, Yahoo at the time. But he made some important and fundamental decisions at a very young age. And I think he will be seen in the context of one of the great leaders of our industry. And I think it's important to say that there's going to be one after him, just as there was one after my contemporaries. And I think you and I have known each other for a long time. It's interesting that having been in this year for a while, we know there's another one coming.
Yeah.
If I could just figure out which one it could be, and I wish I could see it. What I do know is that the next generation of these leaders will be something involving mobile, local, and social, which are the terms we use today for the way people live and work, right? So we've exhausted, right, the legacy, if you will, of the Xerox.
In real time, also.
Well, real time, obviously, video and so forth. If you go back to the history of PC platforms, they were essentially invented in Xerox PARC, where I worked in the mid-'70s. And so you have something which is, 35, 40 years old. We've exhausted what can be done with that kind of a platform. There's a new kind of platform, which is this powerful programming platform, the quick hits, the quick ways, the quick knowledge, the quick access to information, There's a new generation that will emerge that will use that. And the way to see this is to say, I've been pushing this message around mobile first. I've been arguing for a while, this is certainly true at Google, and I suspect with you as well, that the top programmers are now building mobile applications first. Now, it used to be that a mobile application was always the stepchild. It was not a very interesting one, but now the mobile application is the more interesting of the two for a developer because it has location, it has real time, it has presence. You can deal immediately with the consumer. So it's every reason to believe that this next generation of programmers coming out on these platforms will build mobile applications first, and that the best programmers, the best talent, the best vendors will offer mobile services. You, of course, have a significant mobile presence now already, and that the next generation of such startups will be based on that.
So let's go back, again to the past before we jump into the future, because that's your natural tendency, which is fantastic and what I love talking to you. When you look at these great leaders of our industry, which one do you go back on and have the fondest feelings for? I don't know how many of them you've met personally, whether it was Thomas Watson Jr. and Ken Olsen and we obviously Bill Gates you've known for many years, and obviously Larry and Sergey you have such a great relationship with, and Mark and Steve Jobs, and where do you see that? Where do you see the essence of our industry held today, or in the past, and how do you see it brought forward?
What's interesting about the leaders that you described is that each of them is both a technical visionary, a business visionary, and very hard driving. They work incredibly hard. It's the old, Edison quote: "The genius is 90% perspiration and 10% inspiration." But in every case, these are people who woke up and they're going to do this like it or not. So sort of one of the pieces of advice I would offer is that when you can find a young person, and you can just sense that when they wake up in the morning, they're going to do this with you or without you. You're only going to help them. If they're smart and capable, get behind them. Provide them the mentorship, provide them the help, provide them the environment. Give them the support, because they're often young and don't really know how to do things, and they will change the world.
Is that how you felt when you met Larry and Sergey the first time?
Very much so, and it's obvious. And I think that's a pretty good model, again, for life. We were talking earlier about work with smart people. The kind of people I'm describing do exist, and it's interesting, they exist in every period. You mentioned that you interviewed President Clinton last year. When he was in his late 20s, he was a similar force, right? And you could have, had you followed my rule, said, oh, this is an interesting person, I'll follow his or her career. If you look at President Obama, similar. You could see the breakout in their late 20s. So there's every reason to believe that you should keep your eye on these sorts of people. What's nice about corporations is these people show up.
Do you feel that way about Sarah Palin as well?
Let's say I focus on education as an important criteria.
You've had a lot of experiences with President Obama. You've been able to advise him in many levels. What kind of advice do you have for him today in terms of getting our economy rolling and growing and job creation? Obviously, we see a lot of growth in our industry, in your company, in my company, and in this room. But I know as I travel the country and meet with many leaders of different industries, they're looking for growth and they're looking for job creation. How do you advise the president in that direction?
So in my new job, now that I'm executive chairman, I have more time to work on this, and it's pretty disturbing what we're seeing. And it goes something like this. We always assumed that with access to information, globalization, bringing the middle class from the third world, that everyone would prosper. But instead what we're seeing is the Western world with high debt levels and relatively low growth, with some exceptions. Exceptions would be Germany, which made some very strategic decisions a few years ago. People don't know this, by the way, but the union-led structure of labor force in Germany 3 years ago took a significant pay cut to keep their wages competitive in preparation for the emergence of their role. And of course, they do a great engineering job. Our industry, right, which again, we're in our own little bubble, and we sort of understand this. But an awful lot of these awful lot of people are not in such industries, and they're not seeing the benefits of globalization. There are many thoughts as to how this can be fixed. Unfortunately, I think all of them are long-term. If you look, the Western world has largely run out of short-term stimulus ideas. The simplest, if you look in the U.S., you have a problem with the housing bubble and the debt workout. And people have not come up with a system which would allow the repricing of mortgage debt, except for this rather unusual proposal to increase inflation, which is sort of interesting. In other words, if you increase inflation, everyone essentially pays back the debt with cheaper dollars, which of course goes against all of our traditional orthodoxy. So that's an interesting idea. So you have that problem, and then you have the problem of where's the growth going to come from, because you need to grow into another place. If you think it's bad here, by the way, go to Japan, where not only have they had the terrible tragedy of the tsunami and the nuclear fallout, but they have a very high currency. So they can't even export their way out of this growth problem, and they have a very aging population. So I think the sort of policy answers go something like this. You need to focus on getting a better educated workforce, and there are a lot of things that can be done there, and almost none of it's actually occurring, and everyone's talking about it. One of the things I've learned about the internet, by the way, is that everyone feels like they're being heard and nothing changes, right? So the good news is you can be heard. That's no longer the criteria by which activism should be judged, right? It should be judged based on outcomes. But I think the one on education matters a lot. With the White House, I worked on a proposal around advanced manufacturing. Could we bring manufacturing jobs back to the US? There's some evidence that with some industrial policy, which is a bad word, and some additional focus on this, we could build some industries around biotech, new materials, and so forth that would be high wages. But until we can come up with a jobs program that generates real jobs growth in the private sector, we're going to be in this. And unfortunately, I think it's going to be for some years.
In one of my best experiences this year, I took delivery of a new American product, which is a Chevy Volt. I don't know if you've seen it.
I have. They're wonderful cars.
It's a great car. I haven't put a drop of gas into it since I got it.
I don't think it has a gas tank.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
It has the little booster car.
Let me tell you how it works. It's got a battery.
Yeah.
And you can drive it for 40 miles, and if the battery runs out, it's got an engine and a gas tank that will go another 300 miles. Turns into a hybrid, basically,
so
at that point. And it's the Nissan Leaf you're thinking about, which is only electric. So the thing about this car, about the Chevy Volt, and I love it, and I mean, it's great. As I said, I haven't put a drop of gas into it. I've had no maintenance issues. I love driving an electric car because I feel like I'm in the future, which is something that I love. And I always think about, if we can design the Chevy Volt here and the battery technology, and if we can build it here in the United States, why can't we build an iPad here? Why can't we build a tablet here, a phone here? Why don't we have more domestic manufacturing?
We actually looked at this question, and I assumed that it was labor costs. I assumed it was because we had low quality, low wage labor in these typically Asian countries, which is a stereotype everybody has. It's not true. If you look at the global multinationals who manufacture, they have plants, they'll have 20 plants in 20 different countries, and then they'll rate the quality as produced by the plants. And I'm sorry to say that the quality produced in the US plants is not as high as the quality as measured in terms of reliability, robustness, and so forth as it is in these other plants. No one is quite sure why, but it's thought that perhaps it has to do with the workers are better educated or other management techniques.
Yeah. So the 14-year-olds that are building the iPads in China are better educated than our workforce?
I'm just telling you what the result is. And the fact of the matter is we need to address this. So as best
I think it's an amazing thing. I mean, it seems like it's a consciousness shift where we just can't, we don't build stuff here, and that's the way it is.
America needs to be a manufacturer. We have to. We have companies here who are world-class manufacturers in your markets. There are examples in America. There are not enough of them. And it's easy to blame unions, high cost, pensions, whatever. At the end of the day, our American businesses need to be globally competitive for US manufactured products. We have to find a way to get the quality up and the cost competitive, so forth. And remember, we have the benefit of a cheap dollar. which is a consequence of our current Fed policy, it should be possible to do this. Again,
What other
just to be
industries do
clear,
you think we need to
the problem-
rebirth? And manufacturing is one.
Well,
What
but
other ones?
manufacturing is actually a huge problem. Manufacturing, there are fewer people involved in manufacturing in America than there are in healthcare. And so your child, or future child, if you don't have children right now, is likely to be a healthcare worker. And it's very, very difficult to reverse these trends, but we have no choice. Without a manufacturing base, America will not be able to afford the kind of global role that we see for ourselves, whether it's our global military role, our global political role, our global economic power.
What other areas would you double down right now in terms of industry and job creation in the United States?
Well, our largest export industries are essentially aviation, Hollywood, financial services and innovation. See how well that worked. IT and some other export things like that. If you look at job creation in America, it's done by two groups: large global multinationals, which are headquartered in America, which have global footprints. Both our companies are examples of this, but there are many other good ones. Yep. Where essentially the globalization provides the majority of the profits, because you have the fixed costs in the US, and you get most of your profits overseas. And by the way, those dollars sit overseas because we're not allowed to bring them back because of punitive tax policies, which is a side point. And the other part of growth that comes is from small businesses that are growing quickly. So the government, so you were asking about advice to President Obama. The government has a lot that it can do around job creation. And so if I were in that kind of a role, and it's easy to criticize the president, but remember he has a hostile Congress, at least from the political perspective, that he has to deal with, and most divided governments are like that. So ignoring the political questions, what's the right policy answer? It's figure out a way to have every arm of government do everything it can to get people to have jobs. We are on our way in America, and I want to emphasize this, to having a generation of people who will never have jobs. The unemployment of youth, 15 to 22, is about 22% in America today. Many of those people are as they come out of college, it does not look like they're going to have jobs. People of our age group seem to be keeping the jobs. This is not healthy. It's not good. It ultimately leads to societal issues, higher costs, and so forth and so on. Europe has a similar problem, by the way. So we have to figure out a way to get our jobs problem in America fixed. Jobs are created by the private sector, and government policies have huge influences on this. Now, the president next week is announcing a jobs program and a set of prescriptions. We'll see how well those are attractive.
Yeah. And you're working actually on a book right now, right? And actually a fairly sophisticated subject, not about technology, right? Can you tell us a little about that?
I became interested in how governments deal with technology. Partly because I spend a lot of time with government officials. They're very nice, and I have a conversation with them, and they
are some of the nicest people I have met.
Yes, they're all very nice. And you sit there and you go, and they go like this. Yes, yes, yes. I've learned that means that I'm acknowledging, Eric, that you're telling me something. Mm-hmm. And so the gap between our world of what is possible, the implications, what they can do, and the reality of the world that politicians, and not just in the US, but all around the world, live in is huge. And I've come to believe that our industry, and this is perhaps arrogant on my part, that our industry is going to have a much greater impact on governments than we thought. Let me give you a thought experiment. Imagine that you are you're in a repressive a repressive country. And it's difficult for you to have free speech and so forth. And so you build tools which allow you to have a conversation without any inspection by the secret police. So you're in the equivalent of East Germany, and there are plenty of examples of this today. You build all these tools. You can have private conversations. You can have your meetings and so forth and so on. One of the observations is that when you build all those tools, those are exactly the same tools that a terrorist would use in a democracy to take down that democracy. So we as an industry have a problem in trying to understand what is our role, how do we promote open systems. Obviously, we don't want to promote terrorism. I also believe that our industry has many kind of biases. So the open bias, the communicative bias that exists in many of the social services today comes up as a big surprise to governments. And so in looking at governments that assume the Western world, the US, are largely democracies, pretty well run and so forth. And then you have the other choice, which is centralized command and control non-democracies, China being an example. China's going to figure out some way to oppress this freedom. They're working hard on it. But a lot of countries are not democracies, and they're not strong enough to prevent their citizens from getting the kind of technology that we pioneer. So as we go into these countries and as we put in iPhones and Android phones, we want to make sure that American democracy, communications values are the ones that get set, right?
And has that become Arab Spring?
Yeah, and a classic example here is that a combination of unrest, information about the corruption in Tunisia and so forth, ultimately led to a series of actions from some very courageous people using these tools, which were naturally open. An interesting story about Egypt is that the Egyptian government, after a while, became so concerned about the use of the internet that they shut down the internet, and they started SMSing essentially fake messages to the citizens. And citizens are not stupid, they understood that they were largely fake. But the interesting feedback from the Egyptians is that they knew something really bad was happening when they had to shut down the most important thing that they were using. And that in fact, it was probably a mistake to shut it down, because most people were sitting at home having a good time. They were not out on the streets demonstrating. So I would argue that the internet is so fundamental now to the way these societies work that there is a hard bargain that has to be struck between repressive regimes and the internet has a pretty good chance of having a pretty fair fight against a lot of these leaders.
So taking that into consideration, this kind of American philosophy of transparency and democratization of information, why do we have this kind of disintermediation between Washington and the rest of the country, that it seems like our leadership is disconnected from our democracy?
Well, it's possible for political systems to fail, right? There's a lot of literature that political systems, and I'm an optimist about America, and I think that we have been through worse. You know, think about if you were a dad in 1942 and you're watching your 18-year-old son going off to war, you're having a pretty bad day. We've managed as a country to get through this, so I believe that. I do think that there's a set of structural problems in America that are quite real. A lot of it has to do with the fact that our seats are very safe because of computerized gerrymandering of the districts. There's relatively little real competition at the sort of, so that tends to drive a division. And the other thing is that technology used to do instant polling. So politicians tend to react to what voters want very
Is that
tightly.
the head nodding you're referring to?
That's right. So the sum of all of that means that I think we have to sort of think about a system where the incentives are so strongly tied to specific self-interest, of which there are ones on both sides. So I'm not picking a side here, and come up with a way to lessen those. It's been made significantly worse by the campaign finance issues, where again huge amounts of money are going into the government, and that has, I think, in my view, certainly perpetuated a lot of the things. If you go back to the 2008 crisis, there was very, very real harm done to Americans, and yet almost no one has paid a significant price for what they did. It was a real policy failure. It's a terrible thing. Right? So that's evidence of a system that's a little bit rigged. And I'm using strong words here, and I don't mean in an illegal way, but I mean in a structural way.
So when you become president, how do you plan to change
I'm
this?
certainly not going to do that. The most important, if you look in California, we just did a ballot measure, which is actually going to cause us to have primaries at the state and federal level, where there really will be the two most popular candidates will run off in the November elections. And it's thought, and we'll run that experiment, it's thought that that will produce more centrist outcomes. What's interesting is that, another example, if you think about it, our government today is fighting over the spoils of money that we don't have, right? So the debt issue is an argument over spending money that we don't have, okay? So, and there's no limit to the amount of money that we don't have, okay? So it's in your interest, if you're a special interest, to get your fella, you know, or lady, whatever, to go in there and fight for your share of money that we don't have. And at the core of it, until we sort of address that, and the problem gets significantly worse over the next 8 to 10 years because of healthcare. If you look at the Deficit Commission, which is the December release on a public policy basis, all the debates we have, whether it's taxing the rich, changing the structure of the military, food stamps, whatever you care about, has nothing to do with this issue. All of the things we're fighting about have no bearing on the cost structure of our government. It's all about healthcare, and whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth and so on. And we're not having that conversation as a country.
One of the things that Google just did was they just made an aggressive acquisition of Motorola, and when you made the acquisition, you cited it was to pick up the patents for a few $1 billion that you needed those. When you look at the patent system in our industry, does it need to change when a company has to make an acquisition for patents?
Well, the good news is we did it for more than just the patents. I think we actually believe that the Motorola team has some amazing products coming. Products that we've worked with so far are really quite good. Of course, the way our laws work is we announce the acquisition, we have a very nice deal with them, and then we'll wait for federal approval or however that goes, but maybe 6 months or 9 months, something like that. But we're actually very excited about the product line and so forth. Mm-hmm. And to use the Motorola brand and product architecture and the engineers and creative people, I mean, these guys invented the Razor.
It's a great organization.
It's a great organization. You've worked with them as a Salesforce customer, I believe. And we know them well because they are Google Apps customers as well. Walt is here in the room, and on and on and on. So we did it for those reasons. And I think having at least one area where we can do integrated hardware and software and learn from that probably produces better products. But to answer your patent question, the patent issues are terrible. It looks like in the 1990s and early 2000, there were a lot of software patents that were issued that were very broad. And the industry is now spending a lot of time invalidating previous patents. And after a consortium went after the Northern Telecom patents, and I think they were going to go for, everybody thought about $1 billion, and they went for $4.5 billion. We dropped out after a while because it got too pricey. All of a sudden, the values of all these sort of questionable patents just went up and up and up. I, of course, suggested that the correct way to solve the patent problem was to take all the patents as they're published and crowdsource them. In other words, say, here's a proposal for patent. Would everybody comment and see if there's any prior art? Because these poor people in the patent office are overburdened. The only problem with my proposal is it's illegal, right? That in fact, the way the patent system works precisely does not allow for that kind of disclosure. So there is legislation that's in the Senate, which we hope will pass this year, which will both fund the patent office much more and give them the rights to kick out a lot of these patents earlier. But I think that we were fortunate as a software industry that it was not an industry that was defined by patents. It was defined by creativity. With this new sort of patent fights that are coming, I'm worried that these overbroad patents will somehow slow it down. A company like Google, and I want to be clear here, a company like Google has the money to go and fight these wars. We have very, very smart patent attorneys. By the way, you all may not know, but essentially all the patent fights that are interesting are done in one district called the East District Court of Texas. How this is possible is beyond me. But again, it just doesn't feel quite right. Patents are important, but let's do them in a way that's systematic.
Let me ask you, what are you most excited about in our industry right now?
The union of this new platform, cloud computing is something we've talked about for a long time. And the servers, the architecture are now in place. So we take it for granted that your device can talk to your network, it can talk to your servers, it can do it in security. What I'm most excited about is what this next generation of entrepreneurs can do on top of that platform. The combination of things. An example would be, I'm walking down the street and my phone, since the phone sort of is attached to me, and again, this is all with my permission, my phone can tell me where I've been. It can tell me a little bit. I mean, I was at this hotel 10 years ago and I like this room. This is the people I met and so forth and so on. For young people, if you look at Foursquare and those kinds of applications, there's a very high social component. But you can imagine as this technology goes along, the phone can suggest things. And again, all with your permission. It can suggest ideas, places to go, people to meet, people who are like you. Right? All of those things are now possible with a new generation of apps that are on top of this data-centric architecture that you and others are building.
At the beginning, I said there's no company probably better positioned for mobile, Android, for social, Google+, for cloud, your fundamental multi-tenancy architecture and your data center architecture in the technology industry. When you look back now at a decade at Google, what would you say that the seminal decision was that now has aligned up in this perfect storm today for the company?
Well, successful companies are a set of things. So Google was and is this remarkable technical platform. It also was a new way of doing advertising, ROI-based advertising. And if you go back to your career and look at what you've done at Salesforce, what you did at Oracle, what I did at these other jobs, they all had the property that you had an interesting platform that the technologists saw, and you also had a monetization model. The next generation of that is going to be applications monetization, web services monetization, the way these developers, this new generation can make money. Because ultimately, if they want to be very successful, there has to be revenue coming in to focus everything. So I think for me, the fact that we were able to combine those was both the hardest thing, but also the most powerful thing. Because when the two work together, it happens very, very quickly. One of the reasons to think that this is possible now is that it's possible now for a small engineering team to have a global success within a few weeks. Look at typical example, Angry Birds, right? Here's a game which sort of took off. Now all of a sudden it's
revolutionary product.
Yeah, revolutionary product. It's an example of one of these things. There are plenty of these. They're right in front of us. This was not possible before. It's because of the sum of the architectures that we're describing.
It's very exciting. It's an exciting time. Please thank Eric Schmidt.
Thank you all.
Well done.
Thank you.
Eric Schmidt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.